Ever felt like understanding another person's world is more than just reading a textbook? Like, there's a heartbeat, a soul, a whole story you're missing. When we study culturally responsive treatments, how do we take it outside of the textbook and truly allow ourselves to feel and examine our thoughts, emotions, and soul more deeply? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Today, our guest is Dr. Lana Holmes, a licensed psychologist in private practice and specializes in working with sex positivity, BDSM, kink, and ethical non-monogamy, as well as with LGBTQ plus populations and folks who have experienced trauma across the lifespan, especially amongst the marginalized, oppressed, and stigmatized communities. Dr. Holmes uses evidence-based tools like dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and trauma-informed techniques, alongside humor, nerdy references, and musical metaphors. She is inherently attracted to subcultures attached to literary and musical movements that were predicated on personal and collective freedom, self-expression, authenticity, and breaking conventions and exploring new possibilities within art, relationships, and life. So that will likely show up in her work with clients. And Dr. Holmes has a continuing education course entitled Kink and Clinical Practice 101. As an African American Black psychologist, Dr. Holmes will be discussing systematic ways to learn about cultural responsive care in a way that integrates our hearts, souls, bodies, and minds to fully care for people that are marginalized. Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's dive right into this topic that we're going to talk about. We've been talking about culturally responsive care for a while. We've had several episodes about this. We read about it a lot. I think reading is one thing. And so you're trying to really highlight this idea. It goes beyond just reading. So can you share with us what systems you have maybe adopted as part of your clinical work and help our listeners understand what you have observed?
Yeah, no. So basically, the kind of impetus or inspiration for this has been both from my life, but also what I've observed. So just to give background, me as a person, I come from an Air Force family. So I was born in Germany and spent the first 4 years of my life there. And that experience really shaped my view of social justice because I was exposed to a lot of different cultures, engaged in a lot of cultural exchange, but also was taught a lot about my culture and my heritage and my history. And that just informed me in terms of really caring about people, where they come from, including when people face any kind of stigmatization, prejudice, or discrimination. And what I've noticed, particularly as there's been these broadband conversations and initiatives around, being culturally responsive, dismantling systems of oppression as well, a lot of people, particularly I want to say people that come from privileged groups in the context of race and ethnicity, this would be, white folks, have focused a lot on the intellectual piece. And I'm like, but where is that personal piece of like having direct contact and meaningful, close relationships with people from these different communities? Because I think without that, there isn't that visceral response of empathy or care. Because, it varies from person to person, obviously, about what their inroads are for, caring about and becoming conscious of, racism and, white privilege and white supremacy. But I've sometimes noticed when I, for example, have looked at a historical account or a recent news event of something, how it just pulls at me, and how there are some people who will be, there was no emotional response, where it's kind of very intellectual and there has to be like extra effort to be like, well, this is why this is so horrifying, rather than just automatically getting it. And so that led me to go like, well, in addition to the kind of educational component, which I think is important and should continue, what people need, and I think what's necessary is for people to have close, meaningful relationships with folks from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, to have that additional level of care and concern that can motivate people to fight against oppression and to really promote equity, equality, inclusion, and diversity.
Yeah. I would agree with you on that note, which is the importance of extending beyond just the knowledge intellectual piece. There needs to be some sort of formal relationship developed with the people who are struggling, who are marginalized, who are oppressed. The challenging part about that, and hear a lot of podcasts, just structurally as a society,
Mhm.
it makes it difficult because
Mhm.
we think about school systems,
Right.
who's within our community, just, who lives in our zip code, district, all that. There's so much. I mean, I don't even know what the word is in terms of what you
Mhm.
call it, like racist practice or discriminatory practices. I don't even know what to say.
Yeah. The word that comes to mind is segregation, because when you're talking about that, right, you're talking about people who have been deprived of even the opportunity to be around diverse populations. And segregation, I mean, this is something that you look at in different disciplines, the research of how even after all of this civil rights legislation that's been implemented, that there still is a lot of separation in neighborhoods, in school systems, for people of different races. However, there's like a different element of it. And again, this is something that's come not only from my personal life experience, but also just talking to other people who are BIPOC have experienced as well. So one real life example I can think of is like from fourth grade to 12th grade, I grew up in a city and in a school system that, there was a fair amount of racial diversity. However, when I think of my white peers and classmates at the time who were particularly either upper middle class or affluent, I grew up with those kids who were told by their parents, like, you can't have a friend of a different race, you can't date outside your race, you can't invite anybody of a different race at to our home or the family home. You can be nice to them, but just don't have like any close relationships. And so that's another, I think, sometimes unspoken element of there might be opportunities, but sometimes people have been conditioned to say like you can't do that. You cannot have those cross cultural interactions.
Gosh, I'm just thinking about that. I mean, it must have been difficult for you at that age, knowing that this was happening with with your peers.
Oh, it was amazing. I say amazing, but it's astonishing really to think of, because to me, you know, there are members of my family that lived through the civil rights movement and who lived in the Jim Crow South. So I had such a very close knowledge of that, on top of being like directly experiencing anti-black racism. And so I mean, often would get in discussions and debates with kids about like clearly this is wrong and racist, and how a number of folks would kind of just brush it off of like, well, that's just the way it is, or what can you do about it? Like, yeah, but also how some people would defend it. Like, I can remember having discussions with some like white peers or friends of mine at the time who they also thought was wrong, right? But then when they tried to talk to their parents, which by the way, when you're a kid or a teenager, you don't really have the power, right, to like,
Mhm.
overthrow your parents' kind of ideology, the parents would say things like, if there was I can think of one former, white friend of mine from that time period who, her parents opposed her dating interracially. And the reasoning was like, oh, but what about the kids? Like, it's just going to be so hard. Like, if those people date and get married and have kids, and what about them? And it's like, that's not logical as a reason to oppose this. And by the way, these were her parents, like, invited me to her house and liked me, but also like, it's one of those things where it was like, it was confusing, but also it was like really upsetting, because people who were clearly endorsing racism and white supremacy, but would be in denial about it when you directly confronted it or said like, this is blatantly right, like
Yeah.
racist. And it was like, well, But no, I don't see it that way. Or like, I feel like I have a good reason to justify this particular position. And, there were, like, even when that happened, there were also still kids who were white who were able to, like, have friends or date and pursued it. But there's definitely still was that, like, overlying tension and
Hmm.
understanding of, like, you're going to get pushback. I mean, even when I was dating interracially in, elementary, middle, and high school, there would be kids who would be like, like white kids, but also some black kids would kind of be like, "What are you doing?" Like, why? And I was like, so it
It's
was
like
a,
it goes both ways, right?
yeah,
It's like this idea of the social group trying to bring you back, the
yeah,
solidarity piece, which solidarity has both its pros and cons,
mhm,
And so, as you're describing this context, this background, it really extends beyond having formal relationships. And it also highlights that for therapists who are doing this type of work, there is almost a reflecting back of how we were raised. What messages
mhm,
did we receive when it came to relationships? Because you're talking about, well, it isn't just a cultural responsive care. Yeah, I learn about the culture. That's one aspect, but what were the subtle or explicit messages that I was given about dating, about friendships, about making friends and dating people who are outside my racial group? That would, I mean, to me, that would also be a great question to do a self-examination process.
absolutely. Because when you think about like interventions and interventions, not just in a clinical sense, but interventions in a broadband social sense, is it does involve some self-examination. So, you're right on the money about if you're a clinician, particularly if you are a white clinician, but really I would say like everybody thinking about what messages did you receive about engaging in relationships with people of a different race or ethnicity. And so, some points to that is basically doing an inventory of your relationship history with people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, but also considering like, did you grow up in racially or ethnically homogenous or heterogeneous places? And why was that, right? Also being able to look at like how many people of different races throughout your life have you had as friends, partners, colleagues, even because there can be a level of closeness and meaningfulness that can happen from collegial professional relationships, but also, you know, thinking about what contributed to these relationships being formed and maintained. And if you look and say, like, well, actually, I've never had a friend or a partner of a different race, why? Like, why is that? Is in, this is where it can get touchy and where people can become very reactive. But it's like, I think important to be like, why has it never happened? Is it something about a belief that's been implanted in you? Is it because you're afraid of criticism and blowback? Is it because you feel intimidated? Is it because you're afraid of rejection or being hurt? Is it because you were told like that's something that could never happen because of erroneous beliefs like, well, that's unnatural or that's bad or that's, whatever fill in the blank kind of response that you've gotten from family, friends, community. I mean, there's even some people, depending on the religious or spiritual tradition or communities, that's kind of been woven in there too. And being able to look at, is it logical? And I would say there is nothing in terms of research, science, anything that says that it is wrong or bad or unnatural to have close, meaningful relationships with people who are of a different race or ethnicity than you. It's because of these false imposed notions of inferiority and superiority and all of the different concomitant factors around it that usually stops people.
Mm, yeah. So doing an inventory of these relationships,
Hmm.
tell me about other systematic ways that you have practiced this idea of cultural responsive care that you like to share with our listeners who are therapists actively doing this work, who are looking to, I would say, continuing their journey
Hmm.
in this type of work and taking it beyond just the knowledge level.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I would say, because like I've thought about it in terms of like the things that you can personally do and things that can be done in a kind of systemic, structural, organizational level. I have more experience with the personal things, but with the structural organizational things, I have some ideas based on particularly Alport's intergroup contact theory and a lot of the research that's been done on that. So, on a personal level, I would say it is important to take the initiative to try to seek out those relationships. And how that can happen is by making sure that you are putting yourself in a variety of different places and spaces that are diverse. So it doesn't have to be hard. It can be something like, what are your interests? What are the kind of groups or activities that you like to be a part of? And then naturally, like if you see somebody and you're like, oh, this person seems pretty cool and interesting, of actually following up on that instead of going like, yeah, that person seems cool and interesting, but I'm going to keep them at a distance for whatever unknown reason. So I think that is important. Another opportunity could be like work of, being able to see ways that you can make sure like within your own workplaces or professional organizations that you can increase diversity. And again, just like really looking at who are the people who not only, kind of fit this particular role or position that we have, but like could offer a different perspective. Because one of the things that we look at when it comes to the research around diversity, equity, inclusion is that it increases the kind of positive outcomes that you're looking for in a particular setting. So when I look at the research, for example, related to diverse teaching staff in educational settings, the educational and academic achievement outcomes for students improve. And that includes not only BIPOC students, but also white students as well. Similar results have been seen within healthcare settings, that if the medical staff is more diverse, treatment outcomes improve for both white and BIPOC patients. And so I think it's important to consider that, because when you have more diverse staff or more diverse peers, like you get a different perspective that perhaps you would be missing otherwise. Another idea is when it comes to consultation groups or things that you might be a part of or that you might be forming, or even the kind of consultation context that you might have, make sure that they're diverse, not only when it comes to like, I will only go to these people about racial ethnic issues, but about any kind of perspective, right? Because that's something I've seen sometimes where folks may be like, well, right, I will only go to BIPOC folks when it's like a racial or ethnic kind of concern that I have, which yes, it makes sense, but also you could still go to BIPOC folks about depression. You could still go to BIPOC
Right.
folks about trauma related issues, because there can be, again, a different, more nuanced perspective that's added to that you might be missing that can enhance your practice, right? So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize in this is that rather than seeing diversity, equity, inclusion being this thing that poses a loss to people, because I've seen how sometimes that's been framed of like, oh, well, you're going to lose, particularly if you're white, you're somehow going to lose something if you really promote diversity, equity, inclusion. It's like, no, it benefits everyone. Like everybody improves from this. Yeah, and so I think those are like some of the off the top accessible things that you can do, is just taking that initiative. Usually when I think of this particularly, I think of this from the framework of white or, European American or descended individuals. But I mean, also as I've lived my life and done my work, I've come across BIPOC folks who are like, I've not really encountered people who are outside of my community as well. And that can be for a number of reasons. I think sometimes some people are like, I just never had the opportunity. But also some people might be afraid of like, well, what if I take the leap of connecting with these people and I'm discriminated against? It's going to be heartbreaking. I don't want to go through that. And I understand. But also I think, again, in terms of being able to find and work towards healing and reconciliation, it is helpful. So again, a personal example from my life is like, I've always been around people of different races and ethnicities and also other demographic groups. But it wasn't until my late 20s that I was able to have close, meaningful relationships with white people and talk very candidly about racism, white privilege, and white supremacy, and actually be heard
Wow.
and not face defensiveness or, vitriol or, people shutting down or engaging in denial. And that has and continues to be very healing for me, because from that there was problem solving that was be able to be engaged, where like we could talk about like, yo, how can we in our personal lives or in our own, communities and spaces try to like solve these problems that have been created by like white supremacy, racism. And so I think that's what you can benefit from as a BIPOC person, because it can be, I'm trying to find the right word of like, it can be disillusioning when you have those encounters or reach out and people are not receptive. And so there has, at least for me, been a healing component of like, oh, there are people who I know love me and care about me and trust me, and we can talk about this and actually work through it. And there can be good results from it for both of us, you know?
Yeah. And they value you as a person
Mm-hmm.
so much so that your input, idea, and experiences are incorporated, valued,
Mm-hmm.
and appreciated. Yeah. I really do wish they build communities where there is greater cross-cultural interactions. I grew up and went to high school where I would say probably 70% Hispanic. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, it was just natural, interacting with folks who are, say, non-Asian, folks who are also white, Black, and Hispanic. It just came naturally,
Mm-hmm.
just based on the school system that I was in. So we're talking about, the integration of cultural concepts and ideas relationally through essentially our heart and our body. Now, you talk about the soul aspect. Can you share a little bit more about maybe what you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess what I mean by soul is just being able to have this deep emotional connection and bond to these things and these people. So if you're able to look at and hear stories of other people who have a history of marginalization, oppression, stigmatization, and being able to feel empathy and care, to feel that pain that they're experiencing as if it's your own, rather than just going like, oh, that's sad and that's a horrible thing that happened, but not having any deeper emotional experience related to it. And also, I think about it from a spiritual perspective, because to me, like, well, looking at the intersection between mental health and spirituality is another area of expertise that I have. And I think fundamentally, when you look at any of the world's major religious and spiritual traditions, there generally is this recurring message of people being united, people being connected. And I know there's some complexity, and I know there's a number of religious and spiritual traditions where there's been a history of kind of what's sacred being misappropriated to cause harm to people. But I think there's this fundamental grounded message of like, the end goal is for all of us to be able to love and support one another, rather than to be in a constant state of separation or for certain people to be subjugated. And so for me, when I think about it in those terms, and when I think about, you know, all of the religious and spiritual traditions that resonate with me, that are part of my practice, I would dare to say all forms of oppression, including white supremacy and racism, are evil. When you look at what has it's wrought, it is evil. It's led to death. It's led to rape. It's led to mutilation. It's led to various forms of dehumanization. And so for me, when people kind of are passive or casual about racism or white supremacy, I think it's important to understand like there's like those things are fundamentally immoral, unethical, and evil,
Yeah.
and that it shouldn't just be this kind of intellectual exercise or debate for you, but it should be something where when you really think about what this has done to people,
Well,
large
this
swaths
is
of people.
a very spiritual connection, and thinking
Hmm.
about, I mean, there's a lot of different religious spiritual practices where you talk about, you hurt one part of your body is going to hurt the other part of the body, where we're all related.
Hmm.
Um, and so really also thinking about cultural practice is a spiritual connection where this is an evil aspect that has created harm. Like we're actually able to, yes, incorporate the knowledge that, say, racism and white supremacy is the rot, is the evil.
Mhm.
Why can we not categorize it as that and it's actually creating harm amongst a community who is actually trying to thrive? And you're right, most religious practices, I mean, that at least I'm aware of and I tend to, appreciate, does talk about love for others
Mhm.
and building compassion. So, as well, how did you get into this work? Can you share with us any memorable events that maybe influenced how you got here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that it's been kind of this journey, like, to get here. So, when I think about where I started in my, clinical training, going all the way back to like earning a, first bachelor's and going to my master's and going to my doctorate, is it's always just been a part of me, and I've always seen the necessity of it. And I was very fortunate that I was a part of different training programs, right? Like different levels of my education where there always was a component that emphasized like the multicultural aspect of psychological practice, and that being something that's necessary to fully understand people. That you can't just kind of have this vague, generalized way of conceptualizing people and their concerns, but being able to go like, well, how does this person and their communal history, heritage, and experiences, like not just when it comes to oppression or discrimination, but also when it comes to like practices, customs, ideas, ways of seeing the world, inform this person and their symptoms and the presenting concerns. And also that I just naturally gravitate to it because of like my personal background as well. But I think what really deepened it of realizing like, oh, this is something that's needs to kind of be front and center in terms of my clinical work is realizing how it often wasn't fully implemented. When I particularly think a lot of my doctoral training, I had the experience of people who would like, yes, present it, like it would be a part of coursework or it would be a part of like workshops, but seeing how sometimes even the same people who would teach about it, they weren't practicing it in terms of how they were treating people, you know?
Mm,
And so for me, it was just like, well, it's important for this not just to be about regurgitating facts or presenting a theory to people, but being able to really realize how to live it out in the clinical work and being able to connect with people. And that includes being able to understand people, their cultural background, and how their culture conceptualizes and understands healing, but also being able to like integrate that with the clinical tools and work that we have, right? Instead of just saying like, oh, well, that's nice that you have this kind of background or that's where you come from, but
well,
it
it's
has
like
no
you have
merit.
this background, and then I think when we're talking about people who are teaching this course, or some folks who are teaching this course, or the way it is taught,
Hmm.
and it could be constrained because of institutional requirements and systems that are put in place of, well, how do you teach multicultural counseling, right?
Hmm.
And it might just be, well, you read this material, there isn't this lived way of actually incorporating multicultural counseling. And it is important, like you were saying, applying it beyond clinical practice,
Hmm.
living it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in your career as a person of color, what were challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
I mean, there are definitely experiences that I faced discrimination and mistreatment in ways that could, I think, were subtle and insidious through like clinical training and being in different settings. And I would honestly say that I didn't fully appreciate it or kind of come to terms with it until I joined the current practice I'm a part of, which is a predominantly Black female practice, because there were a number of times that I had a lot of doubts about myself, a lot of doubts about my work and my proficiency. And when I would like talk to my colleagues or talk to, my employer, I always got the feedback of like, no, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And it led to some, come to Jesus conversations about why that was and realizing and being told by my employer of like, oh no, that's just like anti-Black racism. This is not a reflection of you and your work. This is a reflection of people essentially trying to make you doubt you and your abilities, whether they knowingly were doing that or not. And so I would say the biggest, I guess, challenge has been navigating the field as a Black person. And I'm not just Black, I'm also a cis woman, and I'm also bisexual. And so encountering like multiple forms of discrimination and being in situations where I knew something, the way I was being treated or spoken to wasn't right, but because it wasn't obvious, not being able to really speak out to it on it, and also because of the power differentials of not being able to necessarily feel like there was going to be a good outcome from speaking out about it.
Yeah, which has come up with some of our prior guest speakers, which is picking the battles,
Mm-hmm.
looking at the context. Is it worth speaking up? And finding allyship in people that are safe to consult with and checking
Mm-hmm.
and possibly rallying a group. Hey, maybe I don't have to bring it up, but is there
Mm-hmm.
a group that can bring it up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And so for you, what does it mean to be an African American Black psychologist?
For me, it means being able to accept all parts of who I am. I think sometimes, particularly in my life, I've had to face people not knowing what to do with me, in the sense of like I don't fit this stereotype of what they have, of what they think a Black woman should be. And so, I mean, I've had to face like not only discrimination, but also people being almost like confused and not knowing how to interact with me because they're like, I have a particular vision of what I think you should be doing. I mean, also in my life, within my own community, I've had to face times where people thought, of like the idea of being an Oreo, of like, oh, you're white on the inside, or you're acting white, or you are trying to like, gussy yourself up to whiteness. And it's like, well, no, I'm just being who I am. And so I think it's taken a long time just to be okay and be at peace with realizing like I am who I am, and that I do not have to fit a certain rubric in order to be Black.
Yeah. And that is liberating for both you and anyone who interacts with you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm thinking about, well, if we have in this idea, what it means to be Black, or what does it mean to be Asian, and then suddenly formulate a composite of behaviors rather than challenging it and say, wait a second, why do I suddenly think this person, in order to be Black, must be this?
Mm-hmm.
That's very restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So, Dr. Holmes, how can we support you?
Well, I am a practicing licensed clinical psychologist at the Center for Inclusive Therapy and Wellness, and I see folks in individual and couples teletherapy. So if you look at the show notes and you know of people that you could refer to me, or you would be interested in working with me, you can go check out my information and see about booking a session. Also, I have a online self-paced continuing education course. It's Kink and Clinical Practice 101. I designed it specifically for pre-licensed and licensed clinicians who are interested in working with folks in the BSM and kink communities, but maybe have little to no knowledge. So it's a very intro level friendly course that I've designed, and it's available through the Touchstone Institute, and the link for it is located in the show notes as well.
Oh, fantastic. Now, that is APA approved, correct?
Yes, it is APA
Oh, great,
approved.
great. Even better. Great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Dr. Holmes, any final thoughts?
There actually is one other thought of some things that could be done in a structural or systemic way that I wasn't able to mention earlier. So one idea that I've had is like looking at a lot of the intergroup contact research that's like based on intergroup contact theory from Alport, is particularly when it comes to building better like racial and ethnic alliances is that being able to focus on building trust, sharing interest, and reciprocal learning about each other's cultures, as well as learning directly about racism and how to dismantle it works. And when I think about clinical applications, one idea that I have is the possibility of clinicians replicating this in the form of psychoeducational group therapy settings, of being able to create that kind of organized opportunity for people to bond with each other, but also to learn more about white supremacy, white privilege, racism, and being able to have both BIPOC and white folks work together to dismantle it.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible and quite brave because you are directly addressing racism and white supremacy as a group and
Yeah.
talking about it. You're not subtly talking about it and
Mhm.
masking it by, oh, we're going to talk about diversity and culture. No, we are talking about white supremacy. We're
Yeah.
going to talk about racism.
Right. And so it's something that I haven't implemented, but it's something just looking at the research around what seems to be effective, I wanted to offer as a possible idea. So if anybody out there, has the desire to do that, I think it's worth a try.
Wow. Well, Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for your insight and just phenomenal ideas and just creative ways to think about this for our listeners and conveying it, in a way that I think sometimes we get lost in the knowledge.
Mhm.
So really to think about, oh gosh, there are other ways beyond the knowledge piece. And I love the sort of like inventory of exploring personally our own relationships and taking it beyond just a therapy room, but start living it as well in our community, building those relationships. And also, I think there's some hesitation amongst BIPOC folks, which is,
Mhm.
"Hey, well, why is this person approaching me now? Can I trust this person?" So I also understand that viewpoint. However, you've also highlighted from your experience that that can also be healing
Mhm.
to understand and recognize, oh gosh, there we can both learn from each other.
Mhm.
Yeah. So Dr.
Absolutely.
Holmes, thank you so much.
No, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much. And yeah, hope that this definitely adds to the conversation and helps.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Their feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.